So what's this heap of junk? Well, this heap of junk was a Braun Paxette Reflex Automatic camera. As you can see, it's a jigsaw puzzle. It's been sitting in my cupboards for a long time. I've had a look at it before and I gave up, but that was years ago and I'm much older and wiser now. And what's more, since I'm retired, I have more time on my hands. So I'm going to attempt to get this back into a working camera because it's worth it. I mean, a proper operating Paxette Reflex must be worth I don't know, $50. But it's the challenge of the thing. I want to make this thing work. It's a decal shutter, and the decal shutter is where I'm going to start because I'm very familiar with these shutters. It's much the same as that used on the Retina Reflex S3, 4 or the Voigtlander Automatic for that matter. So I'm going to start with the shutter. I've had a look at the body. It's in pieces. There are little racks and gears and wheels and levers, all that need to be back in the right place, timed correctly. And it's a bit of a nightmare. So I'm going to start with what I know. I know that the shutter needs to be serviced, and I know I can service the shutter. So I'm going to start there because I need an easy win before I move on to the messier stuff. So let's have a quick look at this. I'll zoom in a bit. As I say, it's a decal shutter, synchro compor. There's a lever on the end of the cocking arm, cocking shaft here, somewhat similar to the Bessamatics. At the top here we have a wheel on the shaft that couples through to the aperture settings. Everything else is basically the same as you'd get on a Retina Reflex. They might be arranged slightly differently, but I'm not expecting to see any terrible things happening there. I think it'll probably be quite good. The cocking action happens at the base of the shutter on this one, so it means it's more like the Voigtlander Automatic. In reality, basically what that means is the shutter's up the other way from a Kodak Retina Reflex, but the only difference it makes as far as users are concerned is that the dials are flipped so that the numbers read correctly on this one when it's fitted to the camera upside down. Right, let me get this all apart and get it fixed, and then we'll go look at the difficult stuff. I've done any number of Retina Reflex shutters. I've got loads of videos on them. You don't need another one. Well, the reason, or one of the reasons the shutter didn't work well is this is very stiff, the blade actuating ring. It may just be down to this spring here. It may be binding a bit. Yeah, it was. So really it's just a lack of lubrication on this spring, on that point, the detent spring. There's just too much friction at that point. It makes this too stiff to move. Well, I've had that apart, cleaned it up, put it back together, touch of fresh lubricant, beautiful and smooth in operation. So I'll just get the rest of the shutter together. Nothing exciting to see there. Alright, it's time to investigate more with this camera. The shutter is all back together again. No complications involved in that really. Very straightforward process. For practical purposes, it's the same as a Bessamatics shutter. This little wheel here, connected to the shaft, couples through to the aperture settings, so that as you turn it, you can see the aperture settings turn there. So as I say, shutter, no problem, straightforward, easy to deal with. And I came back to the body to have a look at this. Well, there are multiple things to do with the body that I didn't know about, didn't particularly understand, and I've got to figure out where things go. Well, the eyepiece for the finder was simple enough because it's screwed in at the back. Likewise, the rewind knob was there. The frame counter. The frame counter is interesting. The frame counter doesn't seem to move freely. Sometimes it moves and other times it does not. So I'm not sure what's going on there. But what I suspect is it's simply the fact that this lever at this end, this mechanism is blocked at the moment because I've got too many things going on. I've got half the guts put back in the bottom. I'll strip it down, we'll show you the counter. Right, the frame counter. Just whip that rewind knob off the top since we don't need it there obstructing things. As you swing the film advance lever, it turns that end of the shaft, moves this lever here, and as that lever moves, it swings on a pivot point at the front here, swings this arm connected up here, coupled up to a piece here. So in theory it should just move one notch each time, but sometimes it doesn't move. So what's the problem? Well, most likely this arm at this point is probably slightly bent, so it doesn't actually move far enough to reliably engage that counter. And the answer will be quite simple and brutal, as things often are. I will simply block the bottom of the lever at this point with a screwdriver, give this little push in, which means it'll then be moving further at this end than it is here, and it should do the frame counter each time. There's a lever down the bottom here causing me a bit of grief at the moment because it catches on things if I'm not watching it. See, that counter's moved nicely there. I've done nothing to it, then it didn't move. Yeah, see, it's sticking at that point. So a little bit of brutality required there, I think, and then we should be good to go. I'm watching that counter, and it's moving reliably one click every time. No problem. See, brute force is sometimes the ideal tool. This piece, that little thing there with the holes cut in the front, that's to couple to the shutter, so it will cock the shutter. Obviously it needs to be driven by something, and how it's driven is with this rack arrangement here, which fits in at the base of the camera and couples to that wheel. Okay, simple enough. We can see how that should work. Of course, we need to get it timed correctly so that the two little holes here line up with the two little pins on this cocking arm. But there's more to that. I think you can see in the base here, see there's a pin sticking up. Well, that pin's job would be to hold the capping plate locked, closed, when the shutter is in the cocked position. So uncocked, it must be down, the capping plate can swing away. As you cock the shutter, capping plate should come down, this should be rotating, cocking the shutter, and that pin that's sticking up, that will hold the capping plate here in place. See if I can get this swung down. Yeah, hold that capping plate firmly back against the inside of the casting. So that appears to be the secret with this little thing. In terms of timing, we need to have it timed so that not only it will cock the shutter correctly on the stroke of the film advance, but that this pin on the shaft at the back here will be in the up position at the appropriate time, because obviously we've got two positions we could put this in, so we can have it 180 degrees out. But we need it the right way round so that pin locks the capping plate at the correct time. So that's another little thing to worry about. And the little piece here that does the cocking, well, you can see it's obviously got the teeth that engage with that wheel, and this thing slides on the rack, and this pin, this post here, that will interact with this mechanism here. Oh, excuse me, got a bit of a cough. So we've got that piece to worry about. This mechanism in here, that interacts with the mirror actuating stuff and the cocking action to some extent, and I haven't quite finished analysing how that thing works. But what else at the base of the camera? Let's have a look at this. So at the base of the camera we'll have our cocking piece here. As the film advance comes round, this will slide back under spring tension. As the camera is cocked, it pushes out till it gets to there and returns under the spring tension. The spring will run between this point and someplace over the cover plate. That part's easy enough. But there was something else in there. Most of these pieces I've had to work out where they go simply by looking at them and seeing what the screw holes line up with. And this is two major components held together by a clip. This would sit on the top like that. It holds our rack in place from underneath, and it interacts here with that main cam there. Now this piece here, this arm, will cock the mirror action. That's what actually brings down the capping plate and the mirror and gets them into position. Our spring that I mentioned before to return this arm for the cocking of the shutter, that must run between this hole and this piece here. I put a few screws in here to see if these pieces would move in a useful looking fashion, and I discovered that the cocking action was a little bit stiff. So what I suspect is the case is that some of these particularly crappy looking shims, let's get the other one in place, I suspect that they sat on there like that and effectively raised this piece so that it wasn't pressing down on here so hard. So it's just a bit more clearance in practical terms. You can see from the rub marks on here and the rub marks on here. Now those two pieces, those two rub marks don't line up with each other, but in both cases those areas have been rubbed down or filed or polished with a bit of emery or something to take some roughness off. So I'm not the first person into this camera, and I would not at all be surprised if that was actually done in the factory when they put this camera together, because it's no miracle of modern engineering. But with this in place, if I put those shim washers in place, screw this piece down, that should pretty much cover those two components. And I'm guessing that this arm sits here, but it has to have its full range of motion, so it must swing through in it like that. But whatever it happens to be, I'm going to have to figure that out. So I'm reasonably happy that I know the purpose of this piece, that it cocks the mirror action. I'm happy that I know the purpose of this piece because it cocks the shutter itself, and it does flow through this little piece here, and I'm happy that I know that this has to be in the correct position and not 180 degrees out, because we want this to trap the capping plate. Beyond that, I haven't really discovered an awful lot more. I did have this piece. This piece is a flash contact, and this piece would have mounted to this point here, to those two screw holes visible there on the frame. Anything else? Not an awful lot. Oh, that's a cover plate that sits over this gear at the base of the camera here. I removed that cover plate so I could see what this mechanism was. So now I need to investigate a bit more. Another piece that I didn't mention earlier is this one. Now what this thing does is it couples with the aperture setting wheel here on the back of the shutter, and the other end of it couples to this shaft coming through here. That little knurled wheel there. And that in turn couples to the setting wheel on the top of the camera body. So this, as far as I can tell, must be fitted after the shutter's in place so that you can get it to mesh with this little gear here. So that's an exciting thing to have to deal with, but no doubt I'll be able to do that. Well, let's be confident about it, I suppose. I expect I'll be able to deal with that. Did we mention this little flash contact here? Yes, we did. Well, this is a bit ugly looking. The plastic is certainly cracked through here and bent. Oh look, it's broken completely now. I'll have to glue that back together. Probably use some super glue to do that. And very likely I'll have to put some glue behind it when I put it in place. It's poorly supported. It's all flapping in the breeze apart from where it's fixed at that end. Well, I'll have to deal with that before I put that back, that's for sure. So that's that flash contact. That's needed with a camera of this nature because normally when the shutter blades are open, the flash contacts are closed. That's the normal way that flash contacts work. But with an SLR, you want the shutter blades open so that you can view the image. So you need some way of opening that circuit while you're viewing, but closing the circuit so that the flash will fire normally once the exposure's been made. And that is almost certainly what this little switch does, is it opens that circuit when the camera is in the viewing mode. I think my best course of action at this stage is to simply assemble the shutter to the front of the camera and see if I can assemble the front of the camera, the mirror box, to the body, getting the levers to sit where they need to sit, and then adding these components to the base of the camera once I've achieved that. My first task I want to achieve is to get the timing correct for the cocking of the shutter at this point. I know what I want to achieve, that I want that staff sticking up that'll hold the capping plate firmly fixed when the shutter is in the cocked position. This is in the released position at the moment, I think. Let's have a look. So I can tell from that which way up I need this thing to be. That was the released position. So in the cocked position, like this, I will want that staff sticking upwards like that. at the back of the camera body. So I'll see if I can get this together and fight the next fight after that. This baffle here, I've had to cut away the broken insulation around that flash contact and put some heat shrink tubing on there so that that contact will come up through here without shorting out onto anything. So I don't know whether I can fit this directly in place or whether I've got to fit the baffle into the front of the housing first in order to get the shutter in position. When the shutter's in position, it's held in with 3 screws from the back, and only 3. Well, that dropped into position with only a very minimal amount of fighting, so I'm pleased about that. Now I've got to try and get these 3 screws in place. Now, finding out what screws go where when you've only got a jigsaw puzzle like this requires looking around for likely screws that'll do the job. Now, I know that these screws are well down in the body and need to pass through that thick bracket, and so these 3 long screws with fairly small heads on them were the only likely suspects, really. They're difficult to fit because you've got to drop them down a hole in order to get them in position, and one of them went into place easily. Its 2 mates decided they wouldn't. Let's see if I can feed this into position. There's one more to do. It's up the top here next to the mirror, so I don't want to scratch the mirror or make it any uglier than it currently is. It's not lining up with the hole very well. Oh, I can see. Here it's dropped into place. Fitting that baffle plate, I had to fit that into the housing first and then fit the shutter. And the baffle plate can't be put in straight. You have to flex it to fit it into position, which is an undesirable way to assemble anything, really. Things should go in a relaxed position. Well, let's just release the shutter from here. And the shutter released okay. Now I've got my shutter in the released position. What I'm looking at here is the position of these 2 pins, and I will have to line up this gear in the body to match up with those 2 pins, and I think I want it in this post here. I want to be in the down position, so I want something like that. When I lower this on there, what do I have to achieve? Well, one of the things I have to achieve is I have to get this cocking arm for the mirror has to pass down into a slot in the body down in here. And at this side, this little lever, which will release the mirror, I have to pull that back out of the way while I'm fitting it into the body, so that a lever down in the body here, this thing, passes between the shutter release arm here and the mirror release there. So, you know, if you have 4 or 5 hands, I'm sure you can make it work. I'm also looking at this cover plate. I can't fit that cover plate once the front of the camera is on there. I could put the front of the camera on there, get this thing to work, and then disassemble it and put the cover plate back once I know how things are supposed to fit. Or I could just chance it and put that thing back in place and see how we go from there. This little sprung-loaded catch which holds the mirror in the cock position, I've got to swing that back out of the way so that it's not fouling the lever at the bottom while I'm trying to put this in position. So I've decided that the best way I can achieve that is to actually put a piece of toothpick or something between here and the top of the housing at this point to block it in the unlatched position, and then reach in from the back of the camera and pull that block away after I've got this thing fitted in position. I don't see any other simple way of achieving that. Almost certainly in the factory they would have had some special jig which did all this for them, but it's bad enough working out how to put this camera back together and what goes where without having to also worry about designing special jigs to achieve these tasks. Hopefully that will do the job. To wait and see. There's no point trying to video the process of me fighting this in. I will need more fingers and thumbs than I currently own. Well, I wouldn't claim it was a startling success, but it sort of works. Things are sticking. That's not cocking correctly. But when it is cocked, that's the mirror cocking action. It's not releasing correctly. If I give it a push here, the shutter runs down. So it is almost working. But I've still got to investigate what the problem is. Something to do with the levers sticking. I suspect that there's something is slightly bent. There's probably friction at some point where there shouldn't be. But I'm surprised. I didn't expect it to go as well as that. See, that didn't cock completely. That didn't release completely. This is the arm that lifts the mirror. If I touch it, or releases the mirror, lets it drop back down, here I can feel it catching on something. But at least I'm getting closer. Well, after a little bit of toing and froing, I have a reliably working camera. What was the secret? Mostly getting everything back in the correct place and getting the timing exactly right for the shutter. Everything appears to work as well as it's ever going to do. And everything, it's looking pretty good, I would have said. The lens opens to full aperture for viewing as it should do. The self-timer even works. So I think I can just about close this thing up. Of course, I've got to get my flash contact back in the base here. The flash contact is here, sits in that spot right there, and this little cam here serves to close the switch, close the flash circuit, so that the flash circuit is live when the shutter releases. So that's looking quite good as far as I'm quite pleased with that. The frame count is even working. so I will not close this right up immediately because it's still a little bit of an unknown. I want to test it a little bit more thoroughly and be fairly confident that this flash switch, which is stuck back together with super glue at the moment, I'll need to be pretty confident that that's going to stay in one piece. It may well be that what I've got to do is laminate another piece of plastic on the back of that so that it's got some guts. Hopefully I can do that without it affecting the height of where that contact sits. Then the meter coupling is the next project after that, and the meter coupling, which is part of the aperture setting coupling, means getting this little wheel back in here so that the worm can change the aperture setting on the shutter itself at that point. But that might be enough for today.